Hey, hello and good morning and welcome from the Property Marketing Strategist. I'm Sarah and I'm one of the hosts this morning. My colleague Deanie is
I'm Deanie.
Other co-host. We feel very privileged to be bringing you this timely webinar on the Renters' Rights Bill in partnership with Housing Hand. Thank you all for joining us. This is the second webinar, so some of you maybe joined us for the first one before Christmas. And there was so much demand around the topic that we had to bring another webinar to it. And I'm sure that even if we talked about it all day, we wouldn't get through everything that you all want to know, but we will certainly do our best over the next hour. There's a lot of noise in the sector. There's a lot of people talking about Renters' Rights Bill, and what we aim to do today is to bring you some actionable solutions. There is a Q&A function on your screen, and so if you have any questions, then please put your question in there. We will do our best to answer it, but if we don't get round to it within the next hour, then make sure that you're following Housing Hand on LinkedIn, and we will hopefully get to all of those questions over the course of the next week or so. So first of all, I would like to introduce our panelists. Ryan, would you like to go first and tell everybody who you are?
Happy to. My name's Ryan Heaven. I'm a consultant solicitor with Woodstock Legal Services, specialising in all things PRS. I was on the last webinar, so if you're here, then maybe I'm a little bit of a familiar face. And yeah, I'm just here to provide some legal insight into some of these issues.
Thank you, Ryan. Delighted to have you. James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm James Maguire. I'm the Sales and Business Development Director at Housing Hand, and I've worked in the property industry for close to 20 years now, in the sort of letting side with Rightmove, and also in the student accommodation side, which I currently work in with Housing Hand.
Perfect, thank you, James. And good morning, Graham. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Sarah, and good morning to everybody. Yes, Graham Hayward. I'm Managing Director of Housing Hand, and just contextually, I guess I've been defining and delivering strategy, particularly in the regulatory sector, for over 20 years. So for me, this is very familiar territory.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to waste no more time and we're going to get straight into it. So I'm going to hand over to Deanie to start the conversation.
That's great, and thank you and welcome to all our audience as well. First up, I think it's probably a good place to start is to make sure that we're all on the same page. What is the right terminology? What category could our viewers be in? So firstly, really, it'd be good to get under the kind of the bonnet of what the distinctions are in the proposed bill, depending if you're PBSA or HMO, or indeed the rest of the rental sector. Ryan, it'd be great if you could kind of start on this and hopefully clear some of the mud.
Happy to. So if this webinar was a contract, this would be the definitions section. So when we're going to be using a few terms over and over again over the next hour, so I think it's best just to say exactly what those terms are and what we mean by them, so we don't have to kind of continually have to explain what they are over and over again. So we'll start with HMOs. So HMOs in this context have got absolutely nothing to do with licensing, nothing to do with additional licensing or mandatory licensing or anything like that. This is the broad definition of what a HMO is, which essentially is two different households living in the same property. So when we say HMO, that's what we mean. Now we're going to move on to PBSA. So as it says on the tin, really, this is purpose-built accommodation for students. And it's expected that PBSA, which subscribe to an industry code of conduct, is going to be exempt from the Renters' Rights Bill. Now, we haven't yet seen the instrument that's going to make that into law, but we're imagining what's going to happen is it will amend Schedule 1 of the Housing Act, which currently says what tenancies cannot be assured or assured shorthold tenancies. There's currently a part of that Schedule 1 which says that university providers of housing are exempt. The expectation is that that paragraph is going to be amended slightly to incorporate PBSA, who subscribe to the Industry Code of Conduct. So when we say PBSA, we're talking about those organisations who are subscribed to the Code of Conduct and who are exempt from renters' rights. PBSA who are not exempt are effectively the same as private landlords in that they have the Renters' Rights Bill, they have to deal with all of that, they're on assured tenancies, and they'll also be using Ground 4A if they want to evict. So we'll move on to Ground 4A. Ground 4A is the renters' rights ground for landlords to get their property back. There are several restrictions on use of it. The property must be a HMO, and again, think back to not a licensable HMO, just a HMO. The tenants must all be students or likely to be students at the start of a tenancy. The landlord has to serve a pre-notice before the tenancy starts that they're likely to use Ground 4A. The contract cannot be entered into 6 months before it starts. Now that one is a new one that came in at the third reading of the Renters' Rights Bill in the House of Commons, so just a few weeks ago, and that's kicked up just a bit more of a stink really about the distinction between how PBSA can market, because obviously they don't have to rely on Ground 4A, so they are not tied to these rules, and how the rest of the market's going to have to operate. Because if a landlord wants to use Ground 4A, they're going to have to make sure that they're not entering into a contract more than 6 months before it's due to start. And then the last requirement is that the notice must expire between two prescribed dates, which is the 1st of June and the 30th of September.
That's great. That was a very long list, Ryan. So thank you for that, and hopefully cleared that all up. And obviously, you talked about kind of accreditation for PBSA. Who needs to be accredited, and what will that accreditation stipulate?
So I'm going to imagine that just like private landlords are going to want to use Ground 4A, PBSA are probably going to want to be exempt from renters' rights. I mean, the context broadly is that a lot of landlords don't want renters' rights to come in. So if you have the option to escape it entirely, why wouldn't you take it? So PBSA need to sign up to a national code of conduct. Now, again, I have to caveat all of this on the basis that, as I said earlier, we don't have the instrument to how this is going to become law. All we have are basically some press releases from the organisations who run the code of conduct, which is Unipol and ANUK, and they run a national code. You can find the national code if you go on www.nationalcode.org. So that's simple to find a thing. The code itself is, I would say, fairly benign. It's got quite a lot in it, but these are really things which are which you'd hope a reputable management company would be doing anyway. You've got things in there about discrimination. You've got things in there about how you should conduct yourself when marketing the property, what information should be available, things to do pre-tenancy, during tenancy, post-tenancy. Again, it's long. It's extensive, it's thorough, but it's not particularly arduous, I would say, for a credible PBSA to meet those standards. So again, if they can meet the standards, get accredited, they can cop out of the of renters' rights entirely, and I think that's probably what I'd expect a lot of them to do.
That's great. And I guess just one last question is kind of the Tenancy Fee Act and who this relates to.
Okay, so this has been we're speculating slightly here because, again, we don't have that instrument. But the Tenant Fees Act applies to three types of tenancy. It applies to assured tenancies, assured shortholds currently, but it will be assured. It applies to licenses, but it also applies to a third category. Now, that third category is the student exempt non-assured tenancies that I described earlier. So basically, these university providers and their halls of residence, the Tenant Fees Act applies to them. And the exact wording is that it applies to the the kind of the class of landlords or the type of tenancy that is excluded from being an assured tenancy. Now, if the way that PBSA is exempt is to amend that specific clause, then PBSA will also be caught by the Tenant Fees Act. So whilst they're free from kind of the shackles of renters' rights, the Tenant Fees Act is still going to apply. It's not going to be completely unregulated. So I think it's just something for PBSA to bear in mind if they weren't already aware of it. Now I will say they should currently be complying with the Tenant Fees Act because they're currently providing assured short hold tenancies. So on that basis, they don't need to do anything in order to continue complying with the Tenant Fees Act. It's just that they can't really adjust anything or step out of what currently the rules are with that.
Great, thank you. I think we are going to talk a bit more about timing now.
Absolutely. Ryan, you're not off the hook yet, so well done, and keep going. So a lot of kind of what you alluded to, and I guess a lot of what's in the bill is about timing, when you can do certain things. So Ryan, can you just mention the key headlines so we kind of know, you know, what are the things in the bill about giving notice by either party, when you can market properties, when contracts can be signed, when people can be evicted, etc. If you can just give us some broad headlines, and then we'll ask some meaty questions to James and Graham.
Sure. So this is really all about Ground 4A because the timings and the restrictions are all linked to that. So PBSA don't need to worry about timings, and it's my belief that this is a serious advantage for PBSA. Because if they are not restricted as to when they can enter into the contract, they essentially get the first opportunity for tenants who are, you know, perhaps more organised. If they're looking for their accommodation, let's say 10 months in advance for the next academic year, private landlords won't be able to enter into a contract with those people until 6 months before the tenancy is due to start. So you have this kind of window where PBSA more or less have free reign. But the two timings are basically 6 months before the tenancy starts. If you enter into it before 6 months, or sorry, longer than 6 months before it starts, then you are not able to use Ground 4A. And so it's not impossible for private landlords to do it. It's just that you are losing Ground 4A. And I think a lot of landlords would probably want the warm blanket of Ground 4A to be with them during this uncertain time. So I would expect private landlords to not want to enter into contracts 6 months before it starts. Then you have the second requirement of Ground 4A, which is the pre-notice. So you need to be telling the tenants that that you're going to be relying on Ground 4A at some point during the tenancy. And then you have the notice requirement of Ground 4A itself. So it's a 4-month notice period. It needs to be a minimum of 4 months, but a Section 8 notice, because don't forget all these grounds, when we're talking about grounds, these are just grounds for a Section 8 notice. A Section 8 notice lasts for 12 months. So basically anywhere between 4 months at a minimum, 12 months at a maximum, you can give this Ground 4A notice. Bearing in mind it has to expire between 1st of June and the 30th of September. What you could do is say on the 1st of October, you could serve a bunch of these notices out ready to just so that students have the longest possible notice period for the next academic year. You don't have to do that, but I think you need to have a date circled in your diary at some point in, say, February, where you are starting to send these notices out if you haven't already done so.
Right, thank you very much. Graham, we've talked a lot about timing and legislation. What do you see as the biggest challenges for landlords, letting agents, operators in relation to this?
Yeah, Sarah, thanks, and Ryan, thanks. That's a tough topic to get through, and it feels complex. And actually, my response to that, Sarah, I think the first item you've got to get right in here or start is actually about communication, and communication, particularly with tenants. What that infers is that you've got to get your own act together in understanding what you're going to put out there. But the tenants need to know their rights. Actually, as a bit of a sidebar, we've just completed a survey of about 70,000 clients. And from that, unsurprisingly, about 75% of them didn't know about renters' rights. Right, so there's a massive challenge and opportunity here. So communication, knowing their rights, Clearly, as accommodation providers, as a group, we've got to update our terms and conditions and the tenancy agreements, and I'm sure Ryan's going to be very busy in that regard to comply with new laws. But the overarching part here is that transitional arrangements have been sort of loosely set in the program by the government, but they're not really published and defined yet. So, this might it will be quite a rush to the start line, but the finish line actually is not immediate. This will take arguably 12 months to actually get to some harmony in the market. So it's going to feel a little bit bumpy, and communicating during that time, we have to be clear.
Thank you. Absolutely. So your message is, don't have to wait. There's certain things that are very clear. Get your house in order because you need to know that.
Absolutely. And as Housing Hand, we are embracing that through surveys and other aspects to then communicate with the tenant side of life. But equally as well, we're working very closely with a number of accommodation providers to make sure that their models and what we do for them actually, work.
And what would someone do if they're if all the students in a house wanted to leave at different times? Is that still open to them?
Yeah, so subject to the definitions that Ryan put there, of course, if you're in a PBSA, they can't leave. They've got a fixed term tenancy. But if you're in a HMO arrangement where there is a right now to give 2 months notice under the new regulation, right, then notice by one is notice for all. So if you're sharing with 3 friends and one decides that they're opting out and gives notice, then essentially that tenancy will end for all parties at that point. Now, really what that means is that the landlord in this context would either enter into a renegotiation or remarketing. But that's not a great position to be in because you're going to be exposed to a void period potentially until the next season starts, unless you can replace or renegotiate.
So ironically, the thing that's meant to give the renters the rights actually takes some of them away a little bit, really.
Well, I mean, this is a renters' rights bill. Right. So you're quite right, Sarah, that for the people that didn't want to give notice, one jumps out. It's like, okay, now I've got to find either renegotiate, which I think is a mutual motivation by landlords and tenants to get something done, because obviously landlords want to continue forward, whereas and so do tenants. So there's an opportunity to redo the deal, but essentially legally it stops at that point. And as a guarantor, our guarantee stops at that point. So you have to really reset.
Okay. And Ryan, I'm just going to bring you back in here as well. I guess who blinks first? What if the students don't give notice and they're not planning to leave? Whose hands does this then fall into?
Well, I will say that is already currently the case. If you're giving out an AST and the tenants don't leave, it goes on to a statutory periodic contract. What's going to change really is, are the tenants going to know that the expectation is that they should be leaving in summer? They have every reason to leave, and there's been a lot of concern that informed tenants will start giving notices early, basically May sort of time when they finish their courses. They don't need to be liable for any longer than they want to be, so they'll just hand in their notices. But it's also possible it could go the other way. Uninformed tenants will not be aware that they're expected to give some form of notice or leave at all, because they didn't understand, as they currently do. If you're signing up from, say, September to September, there perhaps is an expectation you might leave in September. Here, you're signing up for an unlimited period of time, and the only thing that's going to guide the tenant out of the door is going to be Ground 4A. Obviously, PBSA have fixed terms still, so they can still kind of benefit from that certainty. But I will say, broadly speaking, and I do eviction work, most students leave. We don't currently evict a lot of students on Section 21s. In fact, I dare I say a lot of PBSA don't serve Section 21 notices at all, because the expectation is simply going to be that they will leave. it may take some time for tenants to get used to the idea that they have this unlimited contract, and I think that might kind of create a destabilizing factor. And I think that's why Ground 4A and serving it is going to be so important, in a way that serving a Section 21 is not considered to be particularly important.
Thank you. James, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that a lot of students, especially some internationals that want to actually stay on for longer, they sometimes choose other models. So some of the non-PBSA models out there, such as BTR, they like, because they like that community, because it's a mixed community with working professionals. It's still a busy area, even sort of off season, so to speak. So you know, and that's why some choose the HMO. But also a lot of PBSAs now put in plans in place to support these people that do want to actually stay, you know, over that period. So I think, you know, there's still going to be plenty of choice out there of what type of accommodation and for the length of time they want to stay for students, and that's the great the great part of the different models. And actually, there's quite a few of our PBSA partners online today that do have a lot of non-PBSA assets, such as HMO and BTR co-living businesses, and they're able to sort of offer what the tenant actually wants. So if there's somebody that wants to stay on for 18 months or whatever, then they can actually move in, you know, with the renters' rights on a periodic contract with a BTR or co-living, or they can stay in a limited sort of fixed tenancy on a PBSA or with the Ground 4A. So there's lots of choice out there.
That's good to hear. And I guess we've talked a little bit about the timing of contracts, but what's your take on when properties can be marketed? You know, traditionally it's kind of a free-for-all for students, particularly kind of around kind of October, November time. You know, how do you see this changing?
I don't think it will change massively, because I think PBSAs will still go to market with the rebookers, you know, in October, November time. It gets earlier every year. We have some rebooking in September now, but yeah, it's crazy. But so I don't think it will change. Non-PBSA, yes, the ones that want to use Ground 4A will obviously have to do it within the 6-month period, but you know, they can market beforehand. You know, I know there's sometimes restrictions on some of the property portals that you can only market property that you can enter into agreement on a certain basis, but I think that will change as well with renters' rights, because all the major property portals and the student marketplaces will have to change their go-to-market strategies to fit in with the accommodation providers and how they market their portfolios.
Great, thank you. We've got a few questions on the subject of timing, which I'm gonna ask now, probably to Ryan. Ryan, we've had one about if a student has agreed to a fixed term AST in an HMO for 25-26, parents were asking, can they get out of it before it starts, or would they have to start the tenancy and then immediately give notice, as there's no mention of the bill in the tenancy at the moment? That's from Jake Ross.
Yeah, so if you've already entered into a contract, the way in which renters' rights is going to operate is that on a date to be set, the law will simply change. And up until that law changes, there are no extra rights for the tenant or the landlord or anybody else. You can't use the new rules until the new rules actually are enforced. So with this one, if we're kind of saying there might be a gap between implementation date and the tenancy start date of that particular contract, I don't think they can give a notice to quit before the tenancy's actually begun. So yes, they could give it on day 1, but I don't think they could give it on day, say, -30 or something like that. But it's an interesting thing. I might need to give it a little bit of thought, but my instinct there is that until you actually have the first day of a tenancy, you can't seek to end that tenancy. Everything before that point is kind of covered by the current rules about when is a tenancy a binding agreement or when is it not a binding agreement. So assuming it's a binding tenancy agreement currently, which it sounds like it probably is, then I don't think the new rules will change it until the tenancy starts.
Perfect, thank you. And Robin Walsh has asked a question. about, prior to entering the contract, you need to inform the tenant of your intention to use ground 4A to serve a Section 8 for it to be valid. So would that be the best approach, to serve it at the time of the contract so everyone is clear?
Yeah, I don't see any downside to that at all. What I will say is, because everyone's got one eye on the next academic year, there are special rules for next academic year. Bearing in mind we don't yet know when the rules are going to come in. Bearing in mind tenancies may already have been signed to take effect from after the rules are due to come in. So the transitional requirement is that when renters' rights comes into force, you will have a 2-month window to serve that pre-notice. So you don't have to. In fact, you shouldn't do it now because it's not currently the law. You have 2 months from when it comes into force, so you can't do it earlier. You can do it only on D-Day, so to speak.
Perfect. And last question about timing is, as an agent, can we raise a 12-month tenancy agreement for student HMOs more than 6 months before the tenancy start date? That's from Gemma Young.
If you're talking about a 12-month and then you're talking about fixed terms, and it's really important for me to stress that if you're talking about fixed terms, then you're either PBSA, in which case you don't need to worry about what ground 4A says, or you're not PBSA and you're doing it wrong. So I just want to cover off both of those scenarios. This whole thing about restricting from not signing a contract 6 months before it starts, that only applies if you want to use ground 4A, and you only want to use ground 4A if you're not PBSA. So that's the answer. There shouldn't be fixed terms and worrying about ground 4A. They're kind of two different things.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Deanie, I'm going to pass back to you for the next segment.
Cool. Thank you. That was all really interesting. So thank you all for your insights there. I'm going to talk a little bit about payments now. So how can a landlord and operator manage rent and payments under the new legislation? Ryan, I think I'll come to you first, if that's okay. What are the key facts the audience needs to understand around payments and how to take payments and what is possible?
Okay, so there's been a bit of a well, dare I say, an issue recently about the government introducing a ban on advance rent. That was kind of the headline of the third reading of the Renters' Rights Bill, was this new amendment to say you can't take more than 1 month's rent up front. And in fact, that basically meant, the way it's written is that you can't take more than 1 month's rent before the tenancy has been signed. Now, whilst Renters' Rights doesn't apply to PBSA, the way in which Renters' Rights has enacted this change is they've made the Tenant Fees Act, they made it basically a prohibited payment to take more than 1 month's rent before the tenancy is entered into. So the Tenant Fees Act is kind of backdooring this thing into the PBSA as well. So I'm talking now on the basis that the Tenant Fees Act applies to PBSA and non-PBSA equally. There is a ban on advance rent. Now, that said, for students, there is usually you're usually going to be signing the tenancy agreement well in advance. In fact, we've just been talking about how limiting the period to just 6 months is actually a restriction. But there's a long-standing tradition that students enter into a contract way before the tenancy starts. So what that means is you can sign the contract and take the rent in advance long before the tenancy actually begins. So I'm not actually expecting this particular issue about the ban on rent in advance to affect the student sector as much as it's affecting, let's say, the general letting sector, where the tenancy agreement is usually signed and the rent is paid on the same day. You just go into the office and collect your keys. That doesn't really happen with students. So I think I'm less worried for you guys about this particular aspect.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And James, you work with lots of operators and landlords across the country, and you see them setting different levels of rents around the country depending on the product, the audience, and the time of year. How do you think a landlord or operator can be sure they're setting a reasonable rent over that period?
Yeah, great question. I think historically, the best way is looking at the local market and what the achievable levels are. And I think everybody will be keeping an eye on that, because if you set your rent above what is achievable in a market, then it's going to affect your occupancy. So it's really important that people look at that. And of course, there is going to be a an appeals process available to tenants that are come under the renters' rights. So that's going to definitely affect how rents are set. So yeah, I think there's definitely that's that. I would probably say that's probably the best way of gauging it. Everyone will be looking at what their competitors are doing and what the market's doing. I'm not sure whether people will be able to divide 9 months, 12 months into 9, because then that really does push the rent up. And I think we are in certain areas hitting a ceiling. I think last year was a great example. If you look across the market, the student market, there were certain cities that historically would sell out really quickly because the demand far outweighed the supply. And actually in some of those cities, some of the operators didn't actually hit their occupancy targets. And that was because the rents were probably set higher than what was achievable. And affordability is so important to students especially, but the rental market as a whole, including working professionals. So it's important to get that strategy right.
That's great. Thanks, James. And Graham, if I can come to you now, if that's okay. Can you see landlords and operators being able to mitigate any shortfall in rent, or worse, what penalties might they anticipate for non-compliance? Are these changes going to reduce their income?
Yeah, it's a bit of a sort of two aspects to that. Obviously, PBSAs, and again, it comes back to that definition part. PBSAs are pretty much going to be able to have fixed-term tenancies, so no short notice periods being given, and then they rely upon their own risk management processes in terms of how they recover unpaid rents. During that period. The challenge really comes for HMOs, where, as we talked about before, you get a 2-month notice at any time in your tenancy. And of course, that's going to create, a void period. Now, that void period will be a loss of rent once that notice is finished and people leave. Unless, as we said before, that you renegotiate terms and try and get other tenants in place. One of the things that as Housing Hand we've looked at as this has sort of evolved is that in fact we're going to be, when this becomes law, we will be extending the scope of guarantees that we issue, where after legal term and early termination of a student tenancy in an HMO, then we will cover 3 months of rent from the end of that notice period under our guarantee at 50% of the rent. So in other words, you'll get the equivalent of 1.5 months rent during that 3-month period. Now, obviously, there's some exclusions to that. We will be updating our terms and conditions, and the key parts of that are going to be because the first 3 months there's less notices given, so actually and the any deposit and first month's rent payment mitigates that. So we're going to exclude the first 3 months and the last month as well, because most of these, from all of the stats that we maintain around defaults, most of them come in the first 3 months after the Christmas period. So this extended service really gives some major benefit to those that are going to potentially lose rental income during that period.
Yeah, and just to add to what Graham's saying, what that does is it basically gives landlords and letting agents, some security, which doesn't cost them anything at all, because it's something that we offer. And PBSAs already have that security because they're in the fixed tenancy, and we will guarantee the rent up to the end of that tenancy. So it really does, we really make sure that we cover all of our client base, and also we're doing other stuff with our PBSA partners around, custom cover, etc., so that they can cover elements of their risk at a far lower rate. So there's lots of things we're doing to try and mitigate that risk, especially now that the market is not going to have the safeguard of things like advance rent, which was always a security in the past. That's obviously not going to be available now, and so the chances of default is going to increase. And of course, they want to make sure that they have that covered.
James, just sorry, Sarah, I just want to emphasise one little point there. That cover is at no additional cost to either the tenant or the accommodation provider. So this is an extension of a guarantee. So you have to have a guarantee in place before. But should those events happen, then that additional facility is going to be added on.
And of course, to add to that, any non-PBSA has to have ground 4A included in that as well. So of course.
And what I was just about to ask is, I'm interested to know kind of how you came about that decision as a business. You know, was it driven by demand from your customers, so that these are landlords who are already thinking about this and trying to look to mitigate it?
Yeah, I think. Firstly, this was all starting to come about under the former bill that was running through, and we could see that there was going to be a challenge for about 50% of our business is with HMOs, and we were concerned that they were going to have a risk. And we wanted to help them manage that, as well as obviously commercially doing something with no fee, right? Seems nonsensical, but this will increase demand for us and guarantees. So, we're giving that upside, if you like, on one part of being able to sell more guarantees, and then extending the cover on the other.
Right. There's quite a lot of questions about guarantees, actually. Deanie, do you want to
There
go to
are.
these?
Yeah, so I think the first one, Graham, I'll come to you. How do we take on international students if they can't pay upfront and don't have access to a UK guarantor?
Use Housing Hand.
I thought that might be an easy one for you. And we've got one from Scott Lewis as well. For students who don't have a UK guarantor, how can we reconcile the restriction on advance rent payments, i.e. annual upfront rent for an international student, with a restriction with the TFA that no third-party contract, i.e. guarantor product, can be insisted upon unless it's an alternative to something else?
So this has been something that has not really changed with the advent of renters' rights. And Ryan, you might want to add to this, because I know that you've done some work around this, but this is more Tenancy Fee Act and the impact of guarantors and the fee. The actual choice, and Ryan will state this much better than I will, but the actual choice is that you can bring your own guarantor, or you can use a professional service such as Housing Hand, and that's the choice that's there. So nobody is forcing anybody into a band fee, if you like.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Graham said, there's quite a widespread opinion out there that the Tenant Fees Act operates by basically saying you can't insist on someone paying a fee unless it's an alternative to something that is permitted. Now I'm going to get really technical here and say that's not my opinion. I disagree with that opinion. The way the Tenant Fees Act operates is not by saying you must have something permitted by the Tenant Fees Act in order to offer something that's non-permitted. What you have to have is something which is not prohibited. So the logic here is that, rent in advance goes from being something that's currently permitted to something which is going to be prohibited. But it was never about the rent in advance in the first place. What it's about is the offer to accept a UK guarantor. So taking a UK guarantor is not prohibited under the Tenant Fees Act. It's not explicitly permitted because, as you know, in the Tenant Fees Act, there's a whole list of permitted payments and things like that. But guarantor agreements never need to make it onto that list because they're simply not prohibited. So you can say, on one hand, you can give us a UK guarantor, not prohibited under the Tenant Fees Act, or you can use a rent guarantor service. And then because you're offering something which is not prohibited, you can then offer something else as an alternative. So basically, it's all about the semantics here. The difference between something which must be permitted by the Tenant Fees Act versus something which is not prohibited by the Tenant Fees Act. As long as you are willing to take a UK guarantor, you'll be compliant.
And just adding to Ryan's much more technical, eloquent explanation than mine, we talk about UK guarantor. Okay, and I think the UK part of that is irrelevant, right? You can, so guarantor can be anyone in the world. It's just who the accommodation provider decides is acceptable. Right, so you know they can be someone from any country. Now, clearly, in terms of enforcement, it's easier if they're in the UK. But you know, your risk appetite can be a little bit more you know, broad in that sense, and you can take anybody. You know, we have as Housing Hand, we have a 100% record for paying out all valid claims. So, you know, clearly, you know, we try very hard to make sure that you know, we're reliable, we're trusted in that relationship, and responsible as a guarantor. And over the last, I'm sure you can add this, James, but over the last 3 years, we paid out something like 3.4 or settled 3.4 million of claims. So this is not a small undertaking.
No, and just to add to that, you know, when we settle claims, you know, in some cases we get the tenant back on track, so they stay in the, and that's what every accommodation provider wants. If somebody hits a bump in the road where they miss a payment or whatever, and then they get back on track, then the landlord's happy, they're keeping a happy tenant. But just to add to the risk element as well, and that brings us back to the void cover. You know, one of the things that we've identified, you know, through our data is, you know, and it's the potential risk of students, you know, finishing their exams and giving 2 months notice, or you know, or deciding to go home early or whatever. And that's where we see you know, the risk to certainly in the non-PBSA sector where they're not in a fixed tenancy, you know, and we've analysed that data because we have lots of data through defaults, through claims, through absconders, through all sorts of you know, bits, and that really allows us to sort of cover that area, as well as obviously some of the stuff we're doing with our PBSA partners as well.
That's great, thank you. Just to close off, Lily came back on the question that we answered earlier, Graham, but she's come up with another question about, if we use Housing Hand to act as a guarantor for an international student, will the landlord have to pay a fee for this? The tenants used to have to pay the fee.
So the current arrangement is the tenant actually pays a fee for our service. The landlord just has to accept Housing Hand as a guarantor.
Great, thank you. I've got another question here from Amy. So we've got loads of questions coming in at the moment, so we're just going to try and answer lots of these questions on kind of payments and terms. So we might not get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So Amy said, so if I get this right, as we've had this issue, if a tenant wants to pay all in advance and can we take this before the tenancy starts, as long as the contract is signed?
No.
Right.
So there's almost two different conflicting requirements there. You can't take any rent in advance before the tenancy agreement is signed. That's rule kind of number one. Rule number two is, once the agreement's been signed, you can take 1 month's rent. So if they can pay, and they basically want to put their account in credit, after the agreement's been signed, you can take the payment, but you can't require them to do that. So it can't be in your contract or anything like that. And if it were in the contract, it would be unenforceable. And you can't take the payment before the agreement's been signed. So basically, if I try and put these things together, rule one, no payments before the agreement's been signed. Rule two, once the agreement's been signed, you can require 1 month's rent to be paid. Rule three, if the tenant, after the agreement's been signed, if the tenant wants to put the account in credit, you can do that, but you can't require it. Hopefully that answers it.
And Ryan, just to clarify, because we've got lots of questions on this, does that apply to PBSA as well as HMO?
Yes, because this is a change to the Tenant Fees Act, and the Tenant Fees Act applies to everybody.
Thank you.
I've got so from Dan, what happens to existing tenancies occupied by professionals who did not wish to renew, whose current fixed term expires in August, but we have secured a student tenancy for September?
Well, this is the same problem that it's always been, is that you're setting up tenancies whilst there is currently a live tenancy, and that you've no guarantee that the current tenant is going to leave. So this is simply part and parcel of basically arranging these things far in advance, is that you have no guarantee the current people are going to leave. All you can do is really cross your fingers. And like I say, most of them do. That's not to say that your ones will.
There's a question here that I'm quite fascinated by, which comes back to sort of the definitions really, is we're talking about, what can, could people benefit from fixed term tenancies if they believe they are PBSA and they sign up to the Unipol code. So for example, the example that Edward Jeffs has given is, what if there's a building that was HMOs and they are now saying that it's purpose converted? So, is it essentially the same as purpose-built student accommodation?
I think this might be one where I need to give a slightly woolly answer, which I try and avoid doing. But I think this is really going to come down to what the code actually. So we don't know for certain what the code's going to be, but we have got an idea. It's probably going to be this kind of national code, and it's going to be down to the organisations that enforce that code to say whether or not that like a converted block of HMOs is not going to be covered by this or not. So it's my understanding it basically needs to be purpose built, i.e. from the outset it has to be intended to be this thing, not something that's been retrospect. Like if you turned an office block into student accommodation, even if you've complied with the code of conduct, you may not still get the coverage because it's not PBSA.
And Ryan, just to add to your woolly answer, as you put it, is I think there's a bit of a conflict of motivations here as well. If you've got working professionals, in a tenancy, and you're now trying to flip that into a student accommodation, perhaps local authorities might not be too enthusiastic about losing the council tax element of that. So flipping types is going to have all sorts of other implications.
We've got some questions around timing as well. So obviously we've talked about this 6-month period. So is that literally to the date? So the start date of a contract of the 25th of September literally has to be the 25th of March. So you're going to end up with these kind of prorated amounts, and I guess that will impact Housing Hand as well, Graham.
You'll need to be I think just circling dates in your calendar. So some providers simply have all their tenancy agreements start on a particular date, in which case that probably makes this quite easy, because if you know what the date's going to be, then you know what 6 months before that date's going to be. I would be saying, because there is a little bit of legal ambiguity about when a contract is entered into, and I can put my hand on my heart and promise you there will be case law on this over the next few years, because it's so important as to whether or not a ground 4A notice can be served or not. I wouldn't even be giving a contract to a tenant to be signing before 6 months, because there is an argument that basically if you offer a contract to be signed, the landlord would obviously be happy with that contract, because they would be offering it to be signed if they weren't happy with it. So you're making the offer, the tenant accepts the offer by signing it, and that's the point at which the contract's entered into. So it's really ambiguous, and I certainly would not want to be running afoul of a technical legal argument like that. So I really think it's important not even to be giving them the option to sign. You can agree something in principle, you can say, yep, you can take this property, blah blah blah, contract to follow in due course. So you've got it all lined up. But that's kind of to say there are things you can do before 6 months to try and get this property let, but I wouldn't be sending a contract before 6 months.
And Sarah, you inferred that there would be an impact on what we do as guarantors. Actually, we I guess engineered our own processes some time ago, so we don't actually take a fee, right, for the guarantee until the tenancy starts. So no matter when you entered into the contract, yes, we onboard people, and there's part of our fee structure is we take a modest fee up front with that, but none of these are banned under what goes on, but just to confirm, we don't start charging a fee for our service until they take tenancy, not when you enter the contract.
And just to be clear for Lily Ganning, who's watching, is that fee is the tenant that would pay that, not the landlord.
Absolutely, our service is totally paid for by the tenant. There's no impact on the accommodation provider.
Just adding to that, there is some examples though where accommodation providers will approach us and say, I've got a site that's struggling a little bit, so and they'll book they'll pay for sort of guarantees as part of the incentive to get to the occupancy. That happens all the time, and they use that as part of their onboarding. But yeah, as Graham says, the tenant pays a fee, so the accommodation provider and the landlord. And what's really important, there's lots of talk at the moment about landlord costs, with other products out there. Landlords feel as if their taxation is going up, their yields are falling every year, and they just don't want an additional cost. And of course, what you try to do is balance that with the tenant needs as well. So that, and that's something that came up on the survey around the survey we did to the 70,000 tenants that we've onboarded, which were mainly students, but also working professionals, is, they really wanted more knowledge and more understanding of the financial journey, especially students, where it's the first time they're living away from home. They're not financially prudent in terms of like we would like to think we are, and I think this is something that we are going to work with our, great to see some university partners on here as well, who do a lot of work. And I know the PBSAs and a lot of the accommodation sector for students especially try to educate and support students with this, with wellbeing initiatives, and that's something we want to work with the industry on, growing that awareness as well. So yeah.
Thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions about deposits and advanced rent, booking fees, etc. So this obviously kind of follows on from the advanced rent or payment up front, that you clarified very, very well, Ryan. So can you just spend a moment talking about any changes that we can expect regarding to taking deposits, how much, when, and also, what if it's advanced rent and not a deposit?
Sure. So the ban is only on advanced rent. There's nothing affecting holding deposits. There's nothing affecting deposits. So you can take those before the tenancy's entered into. That's perfectly compliant. I think that answers the question. I think that's
so whether it's a deposit or whether it's called advanced rent. So some operators, for example, would take 2 weeks rent up front or 4 weeks rent up front, for example, and that's fine, basically. Or is there a limit on how much can be taken up front?
Right. Sorry. So yeah, the holding fee limit is 1 week's rent, and it can be allocated however you like. There are rules in the Tenant Fees Act currently which say if you allocate it towards the deposit, then everyone knows you need to protect the deposit in 30 days of receipt. If a part of that gets received early via a holding deposit, the 30 days doesn't start when you receive it. I'm trying to think whether or not there'd be anything in there about advance rent specifically. I can't recall seeing anything to say that if you took the holding fee as 1 week's rent and you took the deposit as 5 weeks rent, so you allocate the holding fee to the rent at some point in the future. Is that a ban? I don't think it's mentioned at all.
No,
but there are, like I say, there are rules in there about what happens for the treatment of a deposit. I think that might need to be ironed out.
And a deposit has to be. And a deposit has to be put into a deposit scheme. overall. Is that right as well?
Yeah, so those rules aren't changing. If you receive the deposit, then you should be protecting within 30 days of receipt. Now again, I can't speak for the entire industry here, but I don't know when people are taking these deposits. Are they taking it several months before the tenancy starts? It might just be something to look at, because I imagine they probably will want to be taking what they can take when entering into, or at least before the agreement, to secure their position. But if that means protecting a bunch of deposits early, then that might not be worth the palaver. So there's no right or wrong answer to this, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it feels like the Tenant Fees Act is also something that people need to read up about, as well as renters' rights, because there's a lot of questions here that allude to things that I guess are already legislation. They're not all changes. We have almost run out of time. We have so many questions. Thank you so much to everybody. Before we finish today, I just want to go back to our lovely panelists and just kind of get them to summarise one top piece of practical advice for the audience. Graham, I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, look, it's pretty much what I said up front, and I think, as stated earlier, it's responsible to communicate broadly, as early as possible, certainly with tenants, so they know what they're getting into. There's actually, on a risk side, there's a big risk of, if you don't communicate, are you going to missell? Are people going to understand what they're buying into and find out later that it's something different? So you've got to really get that clarity. And that means to say that you've got to look at your own operating model, what your terms and conditions are, and how you explain these clearly to the tenant. Now, I also understand that the government is going to look, and this is probably more Ryan's territory than mine, but they're looking at template or sample tenancy agreements to say, this is what you should be covering, but they're not available right now. So if you're entering into tenancies right now, this clarity of what it is and what it isn't is critical. And against a backdrop of this 70,000 we surveyed, where people say, I don't even know about this act. So clarity of communication, understanding your operating model is fundamental.
Thank you. James, what's your top piece of actionable advice?
Yeah, I think be prepared. I know it's still not final, but I know a lot of our partners are already taking steps. We're having lots of conversations with them regarding that. Me and some of the team were in Manchester yesterday, for example, talking to our partners, talking to some of our embassy partners as well about this. So that's really important, I think. Looking at your rents, as I mentioned earlier on, and how to set them, I just think keep reading up and following what's happening, which I'm sure everybody, this is the reason why a lot of people are on this call, but we're all watching. I don't think I've ever watched a full session of the Lords before. I did during the week, and I think it's just keeping up to date and asking the questions, so that you are, as we all know, when legislation comes in, like the Tenancy Fee Act in 2019, the redress bodies will look, the ombudsmans will look at how people are adhering to this, and you don't want to be not comply, because there can be some heavy fines out there, and we don't want that to happen. And that's why we all talk to each other and support each other, so that we get the best results, and we still achieve the occupancy levels you want, and the rent returns you want as well.
Thank you. And Ryan?
I think obviously there's still some things that we don't know, but there's an awful lot that we do. And I really don't think you should be waiting for this thing to be signed and sealed by the King to before you start making decisions and changes. Odds are, if you manage an exclusively PBSA stock, then you probably should be looking at the National Code of Conduct and see whether or not you fulfill it, or if you're not already a member. Given the potential benefits to not being exposed to the majority of renters' rights, I think it's well worth doing that, even if you have to tweak a few things. And similarly, you probably know if you're not PBSA, in which case you need to be thinking about when you're going to be serving your pre-notices for Ground 4A, when you're going to be serving your Ground 4A notices, and just getting dates in the calendar and just saying, okay, we're going to send it out, say, 5 months before the 1st of June. To give them a little bit of extra time, and so it's done without there being a last minute rush. If you have a mixed portfolio, then I'm afraid you've got a bit of a headache, because you're going to have to develop 2 completely different systems that do not interact with each other, and it's really important you know which is covered by system A and which one's covered by system B. But I think as long as you get those systems in place, and you can do a lot of that now, because not a lot of the renters' rights are actually going to change. The only things that we really don't know, for the purpose of this call, are exactly the mechanism for PBSA to be exempt. We don't know exactly the wording of that, but we can make an educated guess. And we don't know when it's going to come, and we don't know when renters' rights is going to come into force. But those are really the 2 unknowns, and I don't think that prevents you from making informed decisions now.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for those top tips, and thank you everyone for joining us. It was a really great panel, and I know we've still got loads of questions we haven't answered, which we will do our best to answer, and on Housing Hand social channels, so please make sure you follow those. A big thank you to Housing Hand for partnering us on this and bringing this topic to everyone, because it's obviously one that everyone's thinking about and trying to get prepared for, and still have some questions. So it was great to have all those questions today, and thank you to Ryan, James and Graham for answering those so eloquently. Thank you very much. As I say, do make sure you're following the Housing Hand page, because they will be sharing the answers to some of these questions and keeping updated as the bill goes through. And really big thank you all for joining us today.
Deanie and Sarah, thanks for hosting.
Thank you all.
Thank you.